Hi, it's Alice here. I produce Uncommon Sense. Thanks for coming here to listen to Shahram Khosravi, who talks here about power, being seen, accented thinking, and much more. And in what you're about to hear, we also talk about Iran, Shahram's early life there, and his research too. And I wanted to let you know this conversation was recorded back in December 2025, before the latest uprisings in Iran and their violent suppression, and so also before the strikes by the US and Israel against Iran. That began in very late February 2026. Thanks for listening.
Hello. Welcome to what we're so proud to say is Season 5 of Uncommon Sense. I'm Alexis Hugh Trong in Gatineau, Canada, and I'm here as ever with Rosie Hancock in Sydney, Australia. And we're still the podcast from the Sociological Review Foundation that takes an everyday notion and casts it in a new kind of sideways sociological light. We love sociology, and we believe in getting it out into the world, beyond the university, without paywalls, without jargon.
We're starting this season by talking about being seen, which is something I hear being said colloquially quite a lot these days. Like, I feel so seen by you, or perhaps the reverse, they just didn't see me. And somehow we all seem to know what's meant by that. It's not seen as an exposed or seen as an under surveillance. I guess it's more like another person understands the real you, that what might get called your authentic self, let's say. But there's a lot more to it than that. And the question of who gets seen, by whom, how, and on whose terms is very political and actually very current. I mean, we live in this hyper-connected age that you could also say is a time of hypervisibility, and yet it's also a time of gross dehumanization and gross othering. So I guess we might wonder what that's about and how we do better.
So today we're giving this idea of being seen a bit of a twist and thinking about visibility, about seeing and power with Shahram Khosravi, who's based in Sweden at Stockholm University. Shahram's work covers the anthropology of Iran and the Middle East, migration, displacement, and border studies. His recent work has been on what happens to people after deportation, and he's also done work on waiting, including a study of undocumented migrants waiting for resident permits in Sweden.
Shahram, also a former taxi driver, describes himself as an accidental anthropologist, which we'll get to in a moment for sure. But he was also very intentionally the speaker at the Sociological Review annual lecture at the end of last year, where he spoke to an audience in Glasgow about how to do migration studies in dark times. Hi, Shahram.
Hello. Hi.
Lovely to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we're going to do something pretty radical for this show. New year, new us, etc. And we're going to start with something that normally comes a bit later. So the bit where we ask our guest about someone who gave them some uncommon sense or someone who shaped their thinking. And that's because, Shahram, you speak about your mother and growing up Bakhtiari, the Bakhtiari being an indigenous people of the Zagros Mountains in southwest Iran. It makes sense, we thought, that the start of your story should be the start of the one we're building together today.
So, Shahram, can you first tell us more about the Bakhtiari people, in particular, the Bakhtiari way of seeing and speaking about the world?
Yes. Bakhtiari people belong to a larger group called Lor. They have been indigenous people of Zagros Mountains for a long time. My ancestors have been nomadic people. So just like other indigenous people, in South America, in South Africa, in South Asia, they have a particular way of looking at life, at time, at space. And I grew up in Bakhtiari land, but was sent to school in a city. And during my city-based modern education system, the knowledge coming from my people and my mother was classified as non-knowledge. Yeah. it was not recognized as knowledge. Yeah. I give you one example. My mother, like other Bakhtiari people, used one word for lateness and distance. Yeah. Which was, according to my education school, completely wrong. Yeah. So you have to use two different words for lateness and another for distance. Yeah. Geographical distance. So I grew up believing that my mother was an ignorant person. And it took very long time that I realized that it was me who was ignorant. It was me who was, colonized mind. So for me, it's important to emphasize this, to start with that, with this confession that what modern education does, which is epistemic injustice. Yeah. Epistemic injustice is when you make invisible certain kind of knowledge. Yeah. Classify people as not knower. Yeah. You mentioned that I'm former taxi driver. I put that in my bio because I want to emphasize that the knowledge I produce is not coming only from academia, but also from the years I drove taxi. It was amazing, period of learning about the city, about the people, about the mobility in the city. I want to also say, when I spent time in a prison at the border between Iran and Pakistan, when I was very young, it was the best education for me about border studies. I met many smugglers. I met many people crossing borders illegally. And I learned so much from those people. So for me, it's important to include all these different sources of knowledge.
I love this idea of like trying to expand what we think about as knowledge and where we get it from and what counts as kind of a, valuable knowledge. We recently talked to Babalwa Magokwana about maternal ways of knowing. Babalwa spoke about how in her context in South Africa, these sort of official legacies were extremely important and formative for her own academic thinking also. And there too, they're not celebrated or documented. And, we were wondering if you could tell us more about your mother's way or ways of knowing, because I know you've written about her as a storyteller.
Yeah, I grew up in a village and we didn't have electricity until I was 14. No TV, no internet. So during evenings, the only thing we could do, sitting together and telling stories. And storytelling is not only kind of entertaining yourself or others. Yeah, it's about conceptualizing what is happening around you. Try to create a concept to understand and to show others what is happening to us. Yeah. So storytelling is a kind of knowledge production, which unfortunately, by anthropologists and other scholars have been classified as folklore, as ethnic culture, etc. This is what I want to emphasize again. This is not folklore. This is not ethnic culture. This is also knowledge, yeah, which should be included and recognized in our work in academia. Storytelling is important because it's also a collective act. So when we sat around fire together, or even in dark, and telling stories, so someone started saying something, and then it continued. Other people, jump in and put, details here and there, and every time, story was told differently. Yeah, so it was not like a printed story you read and it's always same. Yeah, so when in that format, old-fashioned storytelling, when it was told differently each time.
The concepts that you're bringing with like epistemic injustice that was theorized by Fricker, is extremely interesting because when you're situating the experience of Bakhtiari people in its geographical context and so on, and talking about migration, there's elements of what you identify that really allows us to think that the knowledge that already exists, right? It's not just that we don't know that it exists, but there are structures that culturally, maybe class elements and so on, continue in kind of reproducing power relations by making those types of knowledge unknown, unvalued, and such. So it's really like an action, right? There's something there about an action that reproduces the power. So I was wondering, like, now that you live in Stockholm, could you reflect on maybe how the way of knowing that you've inherited in your upbringing in Iran contrasts with those legitimated and authorized by the Swedish state, for example, through its educational institution and also its mainstream culture, because it would kind of be an oversight to imply that the invisibilizing or the silencing of different ways of knowing kind of just vanishes right when you hit Europe or even Scandinavia.
Yes, completely. I mean, what is called integration, is exactly what you talked about. Yeah. So integration is about making invisible the knowledge you have from your own people, from your background. It is not valid anymore in this place. To be integrated here, you have to accept the knowledge we give you. So every time, I mean, in the context of migration or, in relation to minorities, but also generally about academic work in knowledge production, every time we visibilize a question, we make other question invisible at the same time. So this visibilization and invisibilization goes hand in hand. Yeah. So the question is, when I bring up a question, what question becomes invisible? That is very much about, in the context of migration, become very obvious, as you mentioned yourself, in the meeting between the migrant and the state, but also very much in academia. What we do in academia, we produce knowledge in a very long process, complicated process called peer-reviewed, process. And this peer review process is exactly, a kind of filter, a kind of purification, you can call it too. You purified a text, you purified an idea to fit in journals, in conferences, in a classroom. And this means you leave out a lot of knowledges, a lot of concepts. And that's very unfortunate.
I just found this element that you identify of purifying ideas, right? I think it really speaks to that idea of how power is organized through knowledge production, because the purification is also a cleaning, right? With this idea that the knowledge as it is in the lives of people is a bit dirty. So we need the academics to kind of just clean this information for it to become understandable.
Yeah. Can I give one example? I was invited to a conference to talk about human smuggling, and I wanted to share my presentation with the former human smuggler. But organizer didn't accept that because he was a human smuggler. And I'm not saying that human smuggling is okay. I'm saying human smugglers produce the knowledge which we need if we want to understand what is happening.
Shahram, I like how you problematized the word peers earlier, and sort of this conversation around how we value knowledge has really got me thinking about your own trajectory into being a working academic, because you're bringing all of these experiences into the knowledge that you yourself are producing. you've described yourself as an accidental anthropologist. And, I'm wondering whether you're thinking about this alternative route, like the time that you spent driving taxis, or like you've mentioned, spending prison in the late 80s after trying to cross from Iran into Pakistan, I think you said. But I wondered if you could talk more to us about this word accident here, like, accidental to whom?
To myself. Because nothing in my early life indicated that I would ended up in academia. During my first 20 years of my life, I spent in Iran. I met more people who have been to prison than people who have been to school or universities. Yeah. So being here in this position was nothing I could imagine, or nothing was indicated by the life I had. And I was driving taxi, and taxi driving was very difficult job, 12 hours driving, and it was before internet. So I was thinking I have to find an easy job. And, academia is an easy job. I talk and get paid.
We're very lucky. I mean, you talked a little bit before about being a taxi driver, and you've just said it. There are aspects of it that was really hard, but previously you were talking about how parts of it were really good. And when I was preparing for this interview and I heard that you'd been a taxi driver, I sort of thought, I didn't want to make an assumption, but nonetheless, I was like, that could be great training for being an anthropologist. And relevant to the topic of today, I wondered about, there is a kind of invisibility that a taxi driver has. And I'm curious if you can reflect on that and how maybe that's shaped some of your work.
Definitely. I mean, taxi drivers, and also today we have delivery workers, yeah? They are, again, going back to invisibility, visibility, yeah? They are infrastructure of a city. Without them, a city is not working, yeah? So people as infrastructure. But as you said, they are not visible as crucial actors. And we have many different other actors too. Without them, a city life collapses. But we don't see them as crucial. We see the police, of course, as crucial. We see politicians as crucial. We see professors as crucial actors, but not taxi drivers, not delivery workers. Yeah. Again, is very much about who is seen and who is actively unseen. I want to emphasize, when I say invisible, people are not invisible. They are unseen. They are actively unseen.
And reading your texts really, really made me think, because like when you're writing, you're talking about sight, right? Well, literal and figurative also, but also various senses and how those allow you to understand things about the world and about people's lives. And you have specifically one piece on doing migration studies with an accent. Could you perhaps tell us a bit more about that and about your experience with this accented thinking?
Accent here, of course, as a metaphor, yeah. So it's not, you use it in linguistically, but metaphor to talk about repositioning myself, yeah. I mean, this repositioning is important because, okay, going back about my time in Iran, about my interest in smuggling, about the people who have been out of the law, who have been excluded by the law, like my people, my parents, myself as undocumented migrant, etc. Yeah. So to see from the other side is important. It is important, not politically, but very much about epistemologically. Yeah. So what happens if we reposition ourselves to the other side? It means that we allow new questions appear to us, or we allow questions appear to us differently. So if we don't do this repositioning, we still in the same way of thinking about smuggling or migration, about borders, about indigenous people. So how can we approach these questions from a new perspective? So accented thinking is part of that. Accented thinking is about accentuate, emphasize. It's about speaking forcefully. Yeah, this is the meanings of accent as verb. Yeah. And I was fortunate to be accented. I was a migrant, I was indigenous, I was accented already in Iran, as a Bakhtiari person. So I grew up as accented already from first year in school. Yeah. So accent has always been with me. So instead of seeing as a lack, how we can use it as a source of knowledge. Same I do with the notion of home. Yeah. So when I realized that I have no home and I will never go back to home, even if I return, there is no home. So how can we this homelessness becomes a source of imagination? Yeah.
What you're expressing, I feel, is extremely rich, as it invites us to willfully reposition ourselves. Now, much of your work is concerned with countering the injustices and the harm of incomplete, unjust representation, with readjusting our optics and such. Can you tell us about your book, Precarious Lives, Waiting in Hope in Iran, and the kind of silences and gaps that it fills?
That book was my second book about Iran. The first one was Young and Defiant in Tehran. Yes, Precarious Life is about precarious condition of young people in Iran who struggle to get access to their citizenship rights. Yeah. So it's very much about migration studies too. So, it's about states designing precarity for people, either migrants here or young people in Iran. The first book, Young and Defined, is very much the focus is about space, is about urban spaces, yeah, about shopping malls, about streets, about houses. In the second book, Precarious Lives, my focus is about time, is on time, temporality. I am interested to look at what waiting does to people, yeah, and how time is used by the state to regulate population, yeah, to delay them, to keep them in waiting, to send them back to square one again and again and again. Yeah. And this is how precarity is constructed through temporality.
Hi, it's Alice. I produce Uncommon Sense, and I really hope you're enjoying the very start of season 5 here as we talk to Shahram Khosravi about being seen. I think it's a conversation that ties into our episode recorded a while back on margins with Rhoda Reddick at the University of the West Indies, where she talked to us about who gets centred and why, and who gets cast out to the so-called periphery with reference to the Caribbean. And if that interests you, why not also go back to Angelique Nixon talking about desire, or indeed Nandita Sharma on natives. Those are all shows, I think, that share similar ground. Meanwhile, if you do like what you hear, please do head to donorbox.org/uncommon-sense, where you can read all about directly supporting the making of this show. The Sociological Review is a charity dedicated to getting sociological thinking out there beyond academia. So any donation you can make helps us to do that via this podcast. And why not check out our lesson plans linked to Uncommon Sense? They are on each episode's individual web pages over at the sociologicalreview.org in the podcast section of that site. They're ready in there for seasons 1 to 3, with more coming soon. And finally, if you have funding to make a podcast, or maybe you're applying for some and you're interested in how we might be able to work together to get your show out there into the world, do have a look at our page called Podcasting with Us. The link is in our show notes. Thanks, and we'll see you back here soon.
Okay, so let's focus in a bit more on being seen. So, Shahram, you have a piece in the 2022 book, Infrastructural Love, which, by the way, is just a really great title, called Bordered Imagination. And in that piece, you reflect on the perennial question, where are you from? And you sort of move on to use, simply as a metaphor, we should stress, the notion of face blindness, of, I'm probably going to say this incorrectly, propsoegnosia in Greek. And could you tell us a bit more about your thinking here?
Yeah, I think this question, where are you from, which is familiar question for all migrants and even children to migrants, is, for me, is interesting because it's not a question. It's not about asking for information about a geography. Yeah, it is rather a statement. And that statement put in form of question, where are you from? I don't recognize you. Yeah, where are you from? I have not seen you before. Yeah, so, but you have seen me before. You have seen me every single day, and you keep asking that question. So there should be something you don't see. And this is how I came to this concept of face blindness. Face blindness, again, I use it as a metaphor, but it is a medical disorder. Some people on the earth suffer from this, and they cannot recognize the face of people they know. For me, this is exactly what happens to migrants, that their faces are not recognizable or are not seen as a familiar faces. It is very much about going, again, this is also about accented. This is about language, It's about whose voice is recognized as a speech and whose voice is recognized as a noise. Yeah, you speak and I hear only noise. Yeah, same about faces, same about being visible. They are very important elements to be politically recognized in a society. This is very much about Hannah Arendt. This is what Hannah Arendt wrote about, human condition, how we appear to each other. If you hear my voice only as a noise, if you don't recognize my face, then how can I appear as a political actor, as a member of a community, as a citizen to you?
I read it, one of your pieces, a story you told, and this feels, particularly relevant, about a time that you gave a talk in Sweden in Swedish, and afterwards there was some discussion about whether or not you were Swedish, and someone said, no, you weren't. And when you asked why, they said, oh, because you can't speak Swedish. When you had just given a talk in Swedish. I mean, it's just kind of, yeah.
I mean, this is what I mean. I mean, it was an amazing experience after 1 hour speech. I mean, my Swedish is very good. It's better than English, And after that speech, I was told, you don't speak Swedish. And said, but what they heard only a noise. So in 1 hour, what they heard was zzz. And that's also very much about race, yeah? So when you look at the face, then you hear voices also differently, yeah?
You write that the person exposed to this sort of metaphorically face-blind gaze is, and this is a quote, deprived of the right to singularity. And it just feels so important to consider this. You know, we mentioned in the intro this idea of the authentic self that's implied in the idea of being seen. But the minoritized, migrantized person is denied that and instead sort of disaggregated into bits. Some bits are visible, some bits are invisibilized or outright denied. And I'm wondering if you can reflect more on this kind of split thing that goes on, where the migrant is both hypervisible, but also denied a face until, and as you write, until death.
Yes, this is what I'm working on. And it was my also focus when I talk in Glasgow. It is about the figure of migrant. And in the field of migration studies is full of metaphors. Generally, in knowledge production, we need metaphors to make unfamiliar things familiar. But we should be very careful not forgetting that they are metaphors. What happens in migration studies is that we have forgotten that these were only metaphors. Take integration, take the notion of people with migrant background. All these segregation, all these are metaphors, but we take them as categories, as real categories, and then we create methods, and then we study them, and we create statistic or description, and we give them life. Yeah, I won't even say that the migrant is a metaphor, because we don't have such a thing as a migrant. We don't have, who is a migrant? A person is a migrant only in the moment of interaction to borders and bordering practices. Say, like a student, a person is a student only during a period she or he is in school or, at university. But we don't keep calling her student the rest of her life. We don't keep calling her children of a student. Yeah, we don't do that. I'm talking about the border regime, how the border regime reduced such plurality of person to one fixed category identity.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the border extends temporally and spatially, like well beyond the site of literal kind of geographic borders, but only for certain, it's very racialized as well, because I find this fascinating. I'm a migrant. I'm like a white person who was born in New Zealand to migrant parents, to a British father and an Australian mother, and I moved to Australia. But at no point really have my parents been treated like migrants in New Zealand, nor have I really been treated like a migrant in Australia either. So our experience of migration is literally occurs at the border in the moment of in the moment itself of migration, and then it ends. But for other people, this, as you say, it sticks to them, and the border never goes away in a sense.
So you keep crossing border again and again and again, and you never arrive. And this is like magic, yeah. So and also what you say is of course is about race, the figure of migrant, but also class. So a color line is always a class line.
I'd like to bring back all of this to the idea of understanding, because a lot of what you say tells us about how that informs the way that you think and critically write about the idea of understanding. And in some of your texts also, you connect this to Edouard Glissant's ideas of transparent universality.
Going back to my background as Bakhtiari, then becoming undocumented migrant, and then asylum seeker, and then a racialized member of society in Europe, I think, the attempts to understand by the state, by the authorities, by bureaucrats, by anthropologists, by sociologists, has, it's not a kind of understanding which is about promoting life. It's not about a knowledge in order to survive disasters. That understanding is about domination, which is, that demand of transparency. And I can tell you, migrants and indigenous people, they are two categories, have been the most studied people in the world. You cannot find any aspect of migration which is not studied. But those information we have, they don't help us to solve the problem. To help migrants, to help the state to solve the problem. So the question is, what kind of knowledge is that? For whom do we produce knowledge? Who is the audience for our knowledge? But also going back to this understanding, when going at Edouard Glissant is about the right to opacity. So the right to opacity, fugitivity, which is also coming from, slavery, plantation history, and Black, resistance, is about not everything should be studied. Not everything we should tell authorities, anthropologists, sociologists. So some part should be hidden, should be protected in order to survive. It's not only metaphors here.
I mean, I think it's so interesting. You're just talking about being a fugitive or opacity, or in effect kind of hiding in a way in order for survival. And yet that too is sort of a privilege, because I wonder if I just think that there's like a whole lot of stuff happening in pop culture where invisibility or being unseen is presented as a power, almost like a superpower. The first thing that comes to mind, if I'm totally honest, is like Harry Potter's cloak of invisibility, but, like superheroes or, that kind of thing. And I mean, it kind of seems like a bit of a con probably, and it's exaggerated in the way that it's sold to us. And yet this idea of sort of going incognito is also a luxury of the privileged.
Yeah, but also not, what I had in mind when I said that was all those people who forge passports to cross a border. They change their name. They come and they lie. They lie to survive. They change their identity, religion, background to survive. So yes, you're right when you talk about, that kind of privilege to be invisible. But I mean, of course, in Japan, there is a company getting a lot of thousands of $1,000 to helping people to disappear. And those people have money to pay and privilege to disappear. But we have also people who disappear at the border. Along the European borders, we have graveyards with unknown migrants, and their families, they don't know what happened to them. They also disappeared, but they are not privileged.
This is quite an important element, because there are moments where people can pay to be less visible or invisible, and there are moments where people are made invisible or disappeared in an act of violence, right? And so it is absolutely clear that this whole aspect of seeing, being seen and not, is about power, is political, and people's profit from that also. If I may, you gave the Sociological Review annual lecture at the end of last year, as we mentioned. That was on doing migration studies in dark times. For those of us who were not there, can you tell us what's the answer? What is darkness exactly? And how can our work really genuinely counter it?
Darkness, I take it from Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt wrote about thinking in dark time in the last century. And what she meant with darkness was not only horrible things like the Auschwitz, but about how horrible things can happen, but still remain hidden or be represented as something else. Yeah. So how we can start a war in name of democracy? How can we invade a country in name of liberation of that people? Yeah. So how horrible things are renamed, denamed, misnamed. So darkness is very much about language. And this is also what George Orwell, talked about. Fascism starts always with language, and how during fascism, language become a tool for defense of the indefensible. So I was thinking, when we are in a new dark time, when language is so misused, look every day what Trump talk about. He says, I want to build the wall against Mexico, and it is an act of love. So for me, it's important how we, in migration studies, but also in other fields, should protect the language. And how to do migration studies in dark time is very much about protection of language and speak clearly, yeah, and speak with courage, because we live in a time that the language is used against us, yeah. So I don't have a clear answer for that question. Is more, the title was more to provoke, yeah. And this is something I'm thinking about. This is something I have been starting. First time was in this accented, doing migration studies with an accent, and now I continue to think about, who needs migration studies? Yeah, I think for me the main question is that for whom we produce knowledge. Yeah, who needs that knowledge we produce?
Shahram, thank you. We have so enjoyed talking to you today. Your work inspires us to see differently, to see better, to speak clearly and with courage as you do. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And what an important way to start season 5 of Uncommon Sense. We'll be back soon thinking about endings and time with Patricia Kingori. As ever, please take a look on our archive on the podcast page at thesociologicalreview.org. And there you can also find the transcripts, the reading lists, lessons plans.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that if there was an award for the most comprehensive podcast show notes, we would definitely be in the running. So there are loads of resources there waiting for you.
And do take time to rate and review us on the app you're using to hear this. It makes a difference.
Our producer is Alice Block, our sound engineer, Dave Crackles. We'll be back here soon. Thanks so much for listening.